Elastic Security empowers security teams everywhere to prevent, detect, and respond to threats quickly through a unified solution. And it's free and open, putting you in control. Use Elastic Security to eliminate blind spots by analyzing all of your data, no matter its volume, format, or age. Stop threats at scale with automated threat and anomaly detection, and arm every analyst with fast search and integrated case management. Download or try Elastic SIEM for free and experience the benefits of an open security solution backed by world-class security research at securityweekly.com/elastic. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Join the Security Weekly mailing list for webcast virtual training announcements and receive your personal invite to our Discord server by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe, clicking the join button. We're also looking for high-quality guest suggestions for all of our podcasts. Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review those monthly, sometimes more frequently. I suppose we should start by talking about TikTok. Is that where...
everybody's on that, yeah.
This article is garnering a lot of attention. My first question for the panel is, I don't believe anything I read on the internet, but are you guys? Has anyone like researched this and can say that it's true, or talk to known, trusted people outside of what we read on the internet to say that TikTok is at least doing some of the things that are laid claim in this article?
I have no idea. I got to be honest.
I mean, I don't think anybody's been able to prove that. I mean, every time that comes up, TikTok denies it, but it is in China. It's controlled by China, and I mean, it makes sense. So regardless of whether it was written on the internet or not, it makes sense that they could be pressured into revealing.
It doesn't make. I mean, just because it makes sense doesn't mean I ran naked through the streets.
Well, but that did happen on more than one occasion. And
get the Ring security camera footage to prove it. Is what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
I've got that shit, man. It's on an SD card
in that one place. In that place one time.
One place in that other thing.
Speaking of Vegas, you ran, and he was holding a Mexican cocktail at the same time.
I think by next week there will be some more definitive answers around certain claims, and or we will see some code pushes to TikTok. So whether they did intentionally or did not, that's going to be kind of the interesting piece. We've said it before, though, like if you are China and you are in this for a long haul, the 100-year war, we're still in that Western mindset of a short-term battle. We can barely think past the year. So if I was going to do it and I was doing a 100-year war, why would you not stand up a whole company, make a very popular app? I don't think they maybe intentionally knew it was going to be as popular as it was. That's pretty hard to, set up and do that. Otherwise, it'd be billions of billion-dollar companies. But the fact that they had some of that built in and have the the permissions and the forethought to have that capability within inside of that app, I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that either their code is tainted and or China is forcing or doing at will things to that code. But whether or not that was all part of the big long-term strategy, I think that's yet to be determined, and maybe we won't know that. And hopefully within the next week or so, we'll have some more definitive answers rather than just someone purporting what they see and we don't really understand their level of knowledge and how they did their testing and how that's corroborated, right? Like that's a something to be determined still.
And just understand that inside of Chinese companies, there is a political officer. Half the people running. I mean, I have actually worked inside of a Chinese company in China for a week once, and there was a person who worked there, and when the incident came up, that person changed into his People's Liberation Army uniform with his officer epaulets and went out and basically got a military unit to go take action as a result of them finding the name of the person who hacked this site. And so I think there's so much interrelationship between the government, the military, and all the people who are actually running things, because you cannot get to the level of I'm running a company without heavy interaction with the government, with the party, with the military. Because if you don't, you're not going to get anywhere. You won't get the permits. You won't even be able to open a shop. So
I was going to say you won't have a successful business without having that.
And I mean, and again, all of this is circumstantial.
Yeah.
We haven't reverse engineered the app and have the screenshots to prove it. Tyler's like, yeah. Well, you know you have, Tyler. I mean, come on now.
But I mean, Tyler's comment about the 100-year war, I would call it the 1,000-year war. I mean, I think China, it's a Chinese tendency to think in a very long, big picture concept, which is hard for Americans sometimes to process. I used to do consulting for companies that want to do business in China. And you just have to understand that I don't know why they wouldn't do what people are accusing them of. I mean, take every app and make sure that the capability, when you need it, is available there. And it's very doable inside of China. It's easy for them to do that. I honestly, if the United States could do that easily and not get caught, or there was no consequence to getting caught, they would be doing it too. I mean, if the United States could go to Facebook and say, you don't have a choice here. You want to keep operating. You're going to make sure that we have this capability. They would be doing it too, and so would everybody else.
I think you have to add to that sentence that we know of.
Yeah,
Doug.
That we know of. I mean, I'm giving everybody the benefit of the doubt based on the law here, but in China that is not the case, and they can do it, and they can come into your business and say, or just make a call to the CEO, who happens to also be a captain in the People's Liberation Army and a party member in the local autonomous region, and say, here's what you're going to do. And they're not going to say, I'm not going to do that. They're going to say, okay, yes, sir.
Pressure versus
it's more
requirement.
insidious than that. The thing, the way I look at it is, when it comes to a given product, you got to look at who's making it and who's influencing it. I mean, even if it's an American company, who's sitting on the board? Who controls where they're going? Are they bringing in sensitive country foreign nationals who are not loyal to the U.S. to do nefarious things? I mean, I know it can be a deep hole you go down when you're going there, but you got to look at it, because it's not necessarily all in China or all in Russia or wherever. It's, you got to look at who's involved where.
Yeah. Because we never bring in hostile foreign nationals to work on classified projects, right, Lee?
Oh, never.
No, never. We built those rockets. We built those rockets all by ourselves.
Yeah.
We never leverage patriots. No.
One could say that also goes in reverse.
Mine's Führer! I can walk! Nobody got that.
But
Not for long.
So there's a lot of interesting things in this article that Lee links to in his stories. Even if you believe that only half of it is true, I think it's still a reason not to have TikTok on any of your devices.
Yeah.
But the bigger question here is now how do you push that down to, say, family members or your 11-year-old or 16-year-old daughter, your grandma, your mom? Like, how do you have these conversations, making it meaningful to them, showing risk to them, and having them want to not have that capability on their phone? Because let's be real, like, there's 5 billion people that read that in the last 24 hours, and I bet there's probably less than 2% of them have uninstalled that app.
The answer is surprisingly simple, Tyler. You tell your children's friends what's going on with TikTok, and then your children will believe their friends over what you say, even though what we do in our careers and have all of us for over 20 years.
Classic psyops right there.
Right?
Classic
Our
psyops.
children are not going to believe what we say.
No way.
Right? I've told my children to remove TikTok months ago. Last year when we covered the story where the U.S. military, and that's the other thing that makes me think there's at least some legitimacy to this article is that last year we covered an article to talk about how the U.S. military was like, you got to get TikTok off of your devices. That's when I said no TikTok. It went away for a little while, and then it crept back in. It wasn't until this became mainstream, and my children's friends were like, you need to get TikTok off of your phones. And, you know, my middle son was like, no, Dad, I'm not. I came home like, you need to get TikTok off your device. Like, bad news, dude. He's like, no, I already did because so-and-so told me that it was bad. I'm like, but Dad, never mind. You know what? As long as it's off your phone, right? I had that conversation with myself in my head.
You start to think about this,
because
like,
your kids' friends are going to believe you.
Yes.
Much more so than your own kids. And actually, you know, the beautiful PSYOP strategy about that, Paul, is not only will that exfiltrate around all these kids, they will actually educate their grandparents as well.
Yeah,
so it'll go back up the chain.
Yeah.
Exactly where you need it to.
Because that's who the grandparents ask.
Yes.
They ask the grandkids.
Exactly,
They're like, what is this TikTok thing you keep talking about? Should I put it on my phone?
And you want your kids saying, Grandma, it's bad. It comes from China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a proud parent moment right there. You really start to think about, though, a lot of the, again, I mean, Paul, this goes back to our prior segment, and a lot of the work that you and I have been, you know, trying to get something put together on is all of these work from home and home networks and the ability to secure them properly. What devices are on those networks? It's all of the kids' phones, it's the kids' tablets, it's your wife's computer, it's the Pinterest, you know, god-awful homeschooling applications and web apps that these places are using. All of these things are within inside of your network and basically your corporate network and boundary now, that your device that has sensitive information on, that has access maybe to customer data, customer networks, like this becomes a really bad day. And this is exactly where we said things were going to start targeting, right? Like leveraging these home networks in order to target and get access to these corporate devices. And once these devices start going back into the corporate network, again, there's a whole nother strategy and a whole nother risk category that I think people are going to have to start coming up with good mitigating strategies, good plans, and then making sure that and ensuring that the devices coming back in didn't get popped or have, you know, some kind of data leakage on
To
them.
that end, Tyler, the scariest thing for me in this article was this this sentence. There's also a few snippets of code on the Android version that allows for the downloading of a remote zip file, unzipping it, and executing said binary. Basically
what could you
means
possibly do with that?
anything that you want, right? Basically, now you have remote command execution on a device that's inside of our home networks while everyone is now working from home.
Yep.
And if you're not embarking on the journey that Tyler and I have been talking about when we talked about in the first segment of segmenting your network and having some controls in place to limit the exposure, that means that now your Android device running TikTok, if it can run whatever it wants, it can make a connection out to a vulnerable IoT device unless you're preventing that, right?
Yeah, my network actually has like 8 different segments now. Because of this.
Yeah.
Right. And an IoT
exactly.
An IoT device with a firmware that was also manufactured in China that's used in like 1,000 different IoT devices that the people that are developing 10-cent games know about because the same person called them and said, you know, hey, I know you guys make thousands of games. We want you to embed this little piece of code in your games.
Right. And here's the backdoor username and password for that IoT device.
And any IoT camera.
Chip level port knocking has been a thing for a very, very long time, and like chip level and hardware level supply chain issues is one of those problems that's not going to get solved. Like we can barely solve some of the fundamentals, right? So the fact that we have all these devices with inside of, you know, all of our networks, our ability to trust hardware at this point is disappeared. And so this just adds another layer of that. And then, you know, these devices, even if you remove TikTok, because of the level of access, purported access that this has, that seems like a very long-term strategy to me. That seems like you have the ability to upload and download and execute, which can you root the device? Can you flash a new piece of firmware? Are you port knocking? Are you setting up persistence on that device? These are things that are
Tyler has the largest tinfoil hat out of all of us. I love Tyler for that, right? Because I was thinking along the same thing. I'm like, okay, so I removed this TikTok app, but I'm like, if I'm reading what I'm reading in here, and that's true, I'm like, what's to say that, like, why am I not wiping all my devices? And then even if I do, right, my tinfoil hat gets a little thicker on the top. Even if I do, what if they've embedded themselves into some firmware subsystem on my phone or my kid's phone?
Bootloader hacking's been a thing on Android for a long time. Like I've been flashing custom ROMs and messing with those for decades. So something it's not out of the realm of possibility that you leverage a script that does roots a device and flashes a new bootloader on that. And once that bootloader's flashed, like at that point, until you reflash that bootloader, which most normal people, unless they're using ADB, are not doing.
Right. Yeah.
That's never going to go away.
But here's the interesting thing for me, in terms of like a security strategy, especially now for your home, because of COVID-19. Obviously, people working from home, right? I think largely we've presented the threats to the home network as someone's going to drive up and be in range of your wireless devices, or someone on the internet, because we're only 10 milliseconds away from every attacker on the internet, someone on the internet's going to exploit something through an open hole or port in your firewall. So if you got a good firewall and it doesn't accept inbound connections, and you've got a properly secured Wi-Fi network, Bluetooth, Zigbee, Z-Wave, whatever it is, right, as much as you can with those particular protocols, that you're good. And what we've always hinted towards, and I think is really coming to fruition today, is that's only a small piece of the picture. Well, I mean, what we just described are several different ways into your home network that is now also your work network and will likely be that for the foreseeable future for many people.
Right.
Because I've seen these work networks where they've got literally a VPN from a device inside the network going back into the corporate network, and everything was being routed through the corporate network. I mean, I saw one very recently, and they were asking me about it. They said, we get so much traffic from all these people. And I'm like, look at your rules. Your OpenVPN is pushing out a route that routes all their internet traffic through your network. And so that means their kids are sitting there watching SpongeBob videos and TikTok, and it's routing through your corporate network. And they were like, oh, well, what should we do about that? And I'm like, don't route their traffic through your network. But, it's like, I had to calm down.
So there's a downside to that, too, because I've consulted with multiple people who are going, nah, we're just going to split tunnel. We can't do it. We cannot send all the traffic in and U-turn it. We're having latency issues. We're having whole family issues, blah, 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 blah. So they split tunnel it, and that opens them up to more interesting challenges, right?
Yeah.
So there's no winning in this. No. And it's... unless you segment the fuck out of your network, which is what I just did. But
and don't use Wi-Fi range extenders. I don't know where you folks fall on this while we're on this topic. There was an unpatched Wi-Fi extender that had a vulnerability. I've always been of the philosophy that if you properly design your Wi-Fi network, and this may mean that you got to run some cables and be creative about how cables are run through your home, especially if you've got an older home that it doesn't have a lot of cables running through it.
Airplane bit.
Right? You got to be creative. You might need a hammer drill and all that stuff, right?
Yeah. You're going to have to get dirty.
You're going to have to get dirty. Exactly. And it does suck. But if you properly design and implement your Wi-Fi network at home, and it's not rocket science for lack of a better term, right? It's just a matter of getting enough access points that are of good quality in your home. You should never come to the point where you're like, oh, I need a Wi-Fi range extender, right? Because to me, they've just all been pretty crappy.
Yeah.
How else am I going to drive around town and make sure I always have Wi-Fi?
Right. Now, the solutions from Google, Google makes a good one. Eero makes a good one. Linksys makes one that does the proper Wi-Fi bridging and backhauling, right? And this is hard to get the specifications, but if you've got a device that has two radios, one to serve clients, one to do the backhaul and connection back in the bridge, that's cool. You're probably gonna have a good time with that, right? But a lot of these Wi-Fi range extenders are just a gimmick.
Nowadays you need
they're garbage. They're garbage. Look, here's the thing: if you're gonna pen test, especially us in the industry, don't fucking use Wi-Fi. Plug the Ethernet cable in, you moron.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Wi-Fi is for the rest of the family. It's not for me.
It's for the phones and the tablets, right? Everything else you should try and get a wired connection. Cables and switches and all that stuff are so cheap. I mean, you can buy Cat 7 cables that are really what we paid for Cat 5e cables back in the day, right? Like, you can probably even get Cat 8 and run. Is it 100 gig that Cat 8 is rated?
It'll run 100 gig.
It'll run 100 gig.
Who even has that speed in the house? Anyway?
What are you going to plug it into that will run 100 gig? But at home anyway. That's the thing. I've got one SSID which my phone sits on. It's the only device on that SSID. But aside from that, everything's wired in my office. Fuck that. I'm not using
I agree.
Yeah.
I did a war sailing attack. So
I remember you telling me about this.
The person had a range extender on a dock that was bridging to their sailboat out in the on a mooring, and it went all the way back to their house. And I was able to get into their house from my sailboat because it was like all default passwords, and so I was able to log in.
Well, then you talk about on the open ocean Wi-Fi signals.
Well, hell yeah, I could
no
pick that
impedance there.
I mean, I could pick that signal up a long way away from that range extender sitting down on the end of the dock, and I even told the guy, and he was like, "Yeah, so what?"
That's a huge issue, not just with people doing range extension, but you start to look at a lot of these urban and in even rural cities where there's not a ton of ISP options. You end up with these ISPs that are running, say, Ubiquity gear on point-to-point or MikroTik point-to-point gear for all their backhauls, and you're providing a direct connection to something that doesn't have a hard wire. You're running wireless back to the ISP. At the ISP level, that brings in a whole nother set of issues that people are not thinking about and maybe don't even have an option for, right? Like these ISPs, how secure is their backbone? How secure is the network and handoff that they're handing? If you're using cable modem, what does their DOCSIS configuration and flashing look like? Like those are all really easy to get. There's been a ton of research on that for years, but not a ton of visibility publicly.
I see what you're saying, but
okay, Tyler, you're killing me, man, because the ISPs are barely capable of. Okay, I'm going to.
But it's a great point though. Like the providers, it's like a cloud provider, right? Like to a certain extent, your security is at the mercy of how your ISP has implemented that wireless backhaul, right? That's not under your control. Now, if you were to purchase the Ubiquity gear yourself and set that up, you'd be more in control of the security. You could make sure the firmware updates are there. I think Ubiquity does a great job of keeping up to date on their stuff. There's always firmware updates. It's based on Linux. They've got a lot of great information. It's very well tested by the community. I know friends of mine that have set up Ubiquity wireless point-to-points, and like not only is the security pretty good, but like they're like the wireless backhaul. Like the technology is awesome. And if I had the same experience with the Ubiquity gear, it's a little on the nerdier side of then plugging in a Google. Home, whatever they call their Nest, or I don't know what they're calling it today, but Eero and those, devices do all that for you, which goes back to our first segment of like, where do you want to be on the spectrum, right? Sure, you could build a Linux embedded device yourself and make it an access point. All the more power to you. You may choose that as your project that you want to do at home, and that's cool, but like how many things can you build yourself from scratch at home, right? Like you're going to run Gen 2, or Arch Linux at home as your desktop, and you're going to build your own Wi-Fi access points from Linux from scratch, and you're going to build your own firewall and run IP tables from scratch. Like, if you can do that, contact me because I want to hire you. But that's not like most of us. We have to.
I've already got a job, man. That's exactly what I do.
Right? Yeah.
I do all of that shit.
and that's cool, right? But some of us want to, like I don't know, Joff, you're just a ninja.
It's just like CAs and code signing certs and all of these. There is a level of trust that you have so much control over, and then there is things that you really do not have that much control over, and ISP and their security is one of them. So that means you have to do and implement as much security and go backwards as far as you can, make sure that like all your TLS and all the things you're connecting is all done well. Otherwise, like
but Tyler, you're going to spend fucking every hour of your night reading through kernel source code, because if you really get down to this, you've got to read the driver source code for every fucking NIC. You have got to read every piece of line of code. And this is the thing.
But while you're doing that, what's the stuff you're not paying attention to, right? Because I think that the best of us, Joff is an example, right? Awesome technically, Joff, obviously, but very good at time management where you can do some of those things, right? I'm not that great at time management, and those.
I didn't say I was good either,
right? You got to pick. Sometimes you have to pick and choose. It's the same thing in an enterprise, right? You got to pick and choose. Do I want to build this solution myself? Do I want to use something open source and customize it? Do I want to buy a commercial solution? And that's just not one decision you're making. That's a series of decisions in the technologies that you're looking to implement. It's the same thing in the home, right? I strongly encourage, don't buy everything off the shelf and go commercial to secure your home, to secure your enterprise, whatever it may be. Have those projects that keep you technical and looking at things, because if you're deciding to go look at kernel code and read driver code, what you're learning there is going to extend to other things, and that's valuable. But you can't look at every single line of code on every single device that you're running in your home.
Nobody has enough time in their life.
Right, exactly.
Look, but entertained the thought and spend some time there. I have developed kernel drivers for NICs in the OpenBSD project in my past. So I have some experience there. Okay? So having had that little bit of experience, it's enough to twig that awareness and keep that in your brain going forward.
I love that, Joff. Yeah, I think you should choose projects that challenge you a little bit, make you learn something, and those skills will transfer to other things as you move forward.
And it makes you think about other things too. I always remember writing. One of the things I took on once was we wrote audio drivers for Gentoo. And it was just a fun thing. We were trying to get it. It was we're going to make this work, by God.
We're just going to do it. Yeah.
And it was lots of gin, lots of sitting around. But I mean, just learning how to do that was very valuable. Even though I never used that skill again, just the idea of it, how those drivers worked, how they fit into the kernel modules and all that stuff was really something that you take away from there, and you'll have it with you for years and years and years and forever.
You should. It reminds me of the time I decided to cross-compile some code that read from a Wi-Fi spectrum analyzer on a MIPS platform. Right? That's not something you might want to do every day, but valuable experience.
Very valuable.
Right? But my point is, you can't do that with every single challenge that you're up against, right? Sometimes you got to be taking I'm going to go buy something to solve that problem, right? Use open source to solve that problem, build something myself to solve that problem, and manage your time accordingly, and be strategic about where you're acquiring skills, and not necessarily pigeonholing yourself into one thing. Challenge yourself, go into a different area,
maybe make you understand what you're going to buy better if you actually work on it. I mean, I worked on.
I've done that too, right?
I worked on IP tables, firewalls. I wrote my own firewalls and all this stuff for years. And when I got to the point where somebody said we're going to buy you a PIX, I had a lot deeper understanding of what was going on, what needed to go on, and what needed to be configured, because I had spent all that time pounding on those IP tables, firewalls that I didn't really know how to do, and I had to do it because I didn't have a choice. And then when I got some commercial product, I really understood a lot better what needed to happen.
And if you're going to buy a commercial Netgear product, you may want to be aware that they just fixes for 10 issues affecting 79 products. One of the vulnerabilities, my comment was, all around the world, it's the same song or vulnerability. Multiple Netgear devices contain a stack buffer overflow in the HTTPD web servers handling of upgrade_check.cgi, which may allow for unauthenticated remote code execution with root privileges.
Yeehaw.
Oh, root privileges. Yeah. Oh, no. I was just doing a pen test, well, I don't know, last week or something. And it's amazing how slack some developers can be, because I love you guys, but you go for the shortcut, and I get it. But you've got
it is because I need to listen on a port that's less than 1025. Therefore, I need to be root, right?
That's right.
That's not necessarily the case, right? And I mean,
but it sure is easier.
It's a hell of a lot easier than figuring out like what the capabilities are that you might need to grant that process so that it can do things that normally require root privileges. Nginx runs the primary process as root, and then all of the children that are serving those processes as non-root, which in containers, as I've talked about in the past, can cause issues because then your container's running as root. So you can, especially in a container environment, it makes it a little easier to map port 80 into a higher port to be able to do that. I talked about that when I presented in the Cyber Jungle and the Container Security Summit.
Look, so speaking of containers, aren't you just in love with containers? I mean, I just Dockerized another thing this week because I'm working on a class, and I'm like, God, that was easy. That was really cool.
You know what's awesome, Jeff? And it ties into another story that I think I put in here about Tomcat having vulnerabilities, which turned out to be, denial of service, and Apache Guacamole having vulnerabilities. Now, Apache Guacamole runs Tomcat. If you've ever done any kind of vulnerability scan on it, you'll recognize that pretty quickly, or even just looking under the covers in Guacamole. But I run Guacamole inside of a container, so it's a matter of me just updating my container. My config stays. I run it. I'm upgraded. It makes upgrading so much easier. To your point, Joff, right? Love containers for that.
It's the agility that you get with it is amazing. Yeah. It's just like, oh, okay, well, I'll just swap that out. Okay, done. Yeah. Okay, move on.
But the scary part is containers are not so always contained, right?
Mm-hmm. That's true.
If you're solving a problem by running container with -- privileged, that means all the Linux capabilities are available to that container, which essentially means even if it's not running as root, it's still running with all of the same permissions that a root user would have access to.
And it still loops right back around to engineering versus security versus putting those two things together. Because engineering is about making it work. And containers are awesome for making it work. Security is about protecting it. And when those two things don't match and they're saying we got to have a production model out by Friday, that's where the engineering part kicks in and the security part drops off the map. And so you got to mix those things together, even in a container.
We did the Container Security Summit, and we had a roundtable. And when I was bringing up some of these issues, John Kinsella caught me off guard, and he was like, well, containers were never designed to provide security. And at the time, I let that slide, right? But the more I think about that, where's the responsibility lie? That means the responsibility lies on us as engineers, whether you're a developer, whether you're a performance engineer, a network engineer, an ops engineer, or a security engineer. The responsibility lies on us collectively as engineers to go, well, if containers weren't designed with security, that means we have to make sure that it's configured, even more so configured and securely implemented securely.
And
I think you nailed the correct term, though, Paul. And the issue with containers is not so much about whether it's secure or not secure. The issue is where is the responsibility? Yeah. That's what everybody's wrestling with, because containers threw this stuff all up in the air because the traditional organizational way of doing things was to say, okay, well, there's security, there's network infrastructure, there's dev, there's, and now containers come along and they pile it all into one bucket. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, how can we do with that? We don't have, we can't go to this group, that. Oh, wait, who's responsible, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where we've got to actually come up with a new model and go, okay, well,
what's interesting, Jeff? Sorry to interrupt, but really quick, and then over to Jeff. But Heather Atkins came on and did. She works for Google, and she runs a large portion of the security engineering teams for Google, and she and Google have been working on combining those roles. And she gave a whole half-hour, 45-minute segment, and has a whole book on exactly what you're talking about, Jeff. Combining all those roles, how does that look in the new organization? It was one of the most refreshing and new, kind of segments that I think we've done to talk about that issue. Jeff.
I was going to say what John didn't say, or the completion of his sentence, is something along the lines of, containers weren't designed for security, but that doesn't mean we're not going to try to sell it to people thinking that they're doing away with their need to do security. Meaning, yes, it's It's a responsibility issue. I have a customer right now who's in. It's been 2.5 hours, and I didn't say PCI yet. I have a PCI customer. Their card data environment, their in-scope environment is completely running in AWS. So I'm smacking full face into here's all the control objectives. Who's responsible? And part of it, I mean, they're doing Kubernetes, at least in part, and they show me a diagram of their AWS architecture, and if I let it blur a little bit, it kind of looks like a network diagram.
Sure.
And it even kind of looks like the sort of the old school 3-tier e-commerce architecture. There's public facing, there's a what they call a bastion area, bastion security group, which kind of looks like a DMZ, and then they have the back end. So I'm having frustrating fun, living the dream of, well, here's the security control. Are you doing it? Well, no, AWS does that for us. Well, let's go take a look at AWS's what they call a responsibilities matrix and see if they are in fact doing that for you. So, I mean, expanding on what you're saying in terms of responsibilities, like within an organization, and I get that, but there's a lot of organizations that don't have that infrastructure in the first place in terms of organization, and they are lured into putting things in the cloud, putting things in containers, because the provider, at least at some level, hints that all that stuff is going to be taken care of. Don't worry about it. And for me, it's the responsibility between the customer and the provider, much more than who within the customer company. Although we're getting to that a little bit.
Yeah. So I see a new role emerging. I see a container security architect role emerging, if not already there, to look at not just containers, because they're not monolithic, to look at containers in terms of their microarchitecture and how the individual components of an application are actually properly secured with the inter-container communications. There's going to be an architect role that's going to emerge.
I think that's one of the big problems that is not addressed, right? We as security, the responsibility does fall to us, but we barely understand it, and that's pushing that tier down to even people that don't have to deal with this stuff daily, aren't trying to break it. Even the developers don't fully understand how a lot of this integrates and how a lot of this works and what needs to be secure. So yeah, maybe the container was set up right, but what about the swarm? What about the API keys? Where's your stuff in your YAML files saved? Those YAML files for your Chef or for your Jenkins server, are those encrypted properly? Can I get access to those? Like, what's the security and layered defense in depth plan for the cloud architecture versus the swarm versus the Docker, all the way down to the Docker level, which people are still getting the fundamentals wrong. So I think because it's getting so complex and that responsibility is getting blurred, the technology is also getting blurred as far as how do we properly do this. And where does this security kind of, we have traditional things for traditional networks. We know password randomization, we know local accounts, we know Active Directory security, but AWS security, IAM, keys, and the full CDIC pipeline, and where those security responsibilities lie, and then how to secure them, that's when it starts to, we've got that breakdown now. So I think we're running into those challenges.
I think you're going to get to a point where you almost have to have like a security flow diagram that shows the responsibilities at each one of those points, because we used to do that with data to show who was responsible at every single point and how it interacted, because there was really no way to sort of conceptualize it. And security seems like it maybe needs to start laying on charts like that, just so you can start visualizing it.
I agree with all this. What I'm seeing as a concern, at least from my perspective, is I'm spending all of my time trying to understand all this new technology, new ways of doing things, and extrapolating it back to the language that I understand, the language of the traditional network architecture, and that's just one element. But further than that, back to the security controls and the spirit of the requirements, the spirit of the controls. What concerns me is, in all the time I'm spending just trying to take the new back to something traditional or old, What I'm not doing, and I don't know anybody that is doing it, is looking at the new and what's wrong with the new that doesn't, necessarily dovetail back to the old traditional way of doing things, because new vulnerabilities and exposures and different ways to exploit and misconfigure and misconstrue the new is out there that I'm certainly not looking at because I don't know that.
What Google, and so if you go back to Enterprise Security Weekly, episode 187, it was segment 3 with Heather Adkins. She wrote a book titled Building Secure and Reliable Systems, Best Practices for Designing, Implementing, and Maintaining Systems. And what Heather, and largely Google, is trying to evangelize is this merging of roles that, while yes, you still have security people, yes, you still have developers, but you also have folks that have merged these roles together, that operations, sysadmin, networking, security, and programming are now part of a skill set that becomes a role. Some of that takes shape in what they call a reliability engineer, because building resilient and maintainable systems speaks to security, certainly, is that they're challenging the notions of these traditional roles that we've had in IT and blending them more into one. And the larger companies, Google, Netflix, as an example, have already been doing this for some time because they've embraced these new technologies and recognized the need for security, also have the funding to fund these type of operations, right? I think that's going to start to permeate, or it already has started to permeate into other organizations, that you will no longer have that traditional role of, well, I'm just a network engineer, I'm just a systems, I'm just a programmer, right? I mean, you will, like in an ISP, we need people to run the internet, right? And those people are going to be network engineers. Don't get me wrong, right, Joff? Like, you're going to need the people that run the BGP tables and help keep the internet safe. But when we're talking about deploying software, you're still going to
need infrastructure,
yeah, you're still going to need infrastructure, right? Not for every organization.
You're going to need base infrastructure, but I definitely foresee a role that emerges where there's a security entity that is part of the SecOps group, or the DevOps group, but they don't primarily develop. They have enough familiarity with the containerized development world to understand it, but they plug into the development lifecycle to secure it. And that's really what I was talking about. A container security architect.
Yes.
There's a number of words you could probably ascribe to it, but I think that role has to emerge, because you think about it from the developer's perspective right now. If you're a developer and you have no security experience at all, or minimal, just sort of doing your best, there's got to be stress there right now. There has to be a level of anxiety that's really, because a lot got piled on them all of a sudden, right?
Yeah, and I think security's role becomes more of research and threat analysis, right? Understanding what the new threats are, but then being able to understand what the impact is to the business, to the processes, to the different groups, and explaining that and building that into the process, right? Because even Utopia is, we have roles that understand infrastructure code and security and can implement that process, so we've got resilient systems, right? Security's role is, I'm looking at these new threats in this new research, and therefore I want to go back to that person and say, we need to consider these things and change our process slightly, right? And that's the kind of process cycle.
That doesn't even address SaaS or single sign-on issues that now are being implemented into this already complex and multifaceted thing.
Identity is an issue.
But you know what? I'm always an optimist when it comes to new software architectures, and I am an optimist when it comes to this one, because this, for the information security community, is one of the first times where we have a solid opportunity to insert ourselves into the development lifecycle in an agile and meaningful way. And we've never had that opportunity before. We've always been considered like the last step. Oh, well, go ahead and assess my app when it's done and tell me where I broke it, which is exactly the wrong way to do it. But if you're actually in the pipeline, that has significant advantage. That is a significant opportunity.
Absolutely.
I agree with that, Joff. But what is the impetus for companies to promote something like that? Or is it more us as a community at a macro level?
I think it's the same impetus as before. If you don't do it, you're going to get spanked. I mean, It really is the same.
No, to that point, Joff, I think that you can sell security and this newer process that we're talking about I can crank out new features more quickly, right? If you work towards building this system where I can spin up an application, I can go test it automatically, funnel those results back in, and have these repeatable processes running, it means I can go implement a new feature, I can throw it into my CI/CD pipeline as an example, and it goes and gets security tested, and if there's an issue, it comes back to me as a developer, I fix it, and I push it back through. It's a repeatable process. Therefore, my kind of sales pitch to the business is, yes, we might take a hit and a step back in productivity to implement these things, but moving forward, it means we can constantly push out new stuff and have that be implemented and deployed more securely and more reliable than before. That's
so the operational agility gives us enough flexibility from a development perspective to quickly rectify and then move on again. So that's actually a very important point. We never had that agility before. If you inserted yourself in the software dev lifecycle and managed to successfly do it as a security group,
you just slowed it down. Yeah.
You slowed it down. Fantastic, well done. But now I think there's a much more dynamic cycle, and there's much more agility and acceptance to change a portion of the application, not just the entire application. That's the other thing. Monolithic versus component of an application. These are a big deal. So it is. I'm opportunistic. I've always been an opportunist kind of guy when it comes to this stuff. But I'm happy. I'm happy that the agility is there, because it does give us significant opportunities there, significant advantages.
I think some of the companies are also having to adapt and adopt some of these new technologies and new pipelines because of the amount of talent that's available. And a lot of the newer developers, a lot of the newer programmers, a lot of the I call them hipster DevOps. These people are the ones that are becoming more widely available and have kind of the new edge to make your apps more streamlined, be mobile platform enabled, be agile, be very, very quick. So I think these companies are having and have the incentive to adopt a lot of this new stuff based on a lot of the things that those technologies bring from the development standpoint.
Yeah, I think there's a great benefit to adopting some of these newer practices, right? It's hard because we have so much legacy code. As evidenced by, we still see security advisories for Cisco running Telnet. Like, really? Like, I thought, really? Like, really? So the
one that kills me in the infrastructure space, and I literally found it last week, is the smart install stuff. Right? And that vulnerability, so Cisco smart install, and I'm not banging on Cisco here.
Wait, what's a smart
maybe
install?
Maybe just a little bit.
What's a smart install in Cisco? I don't remember now.
So it's an API that they've got. It's a Webby-driven thing. But the problem with the vulnerability is you could send a single packet to the box, which changed this TFTP address, and then force it to TFTP to config to you, the attacker.
Oh.
Where could that go wrong, right? And things like, you find those things, and then things like good old Cisco Type 7.
I was going to say that comes to how you're hashing your passwords and your config, right? Because no one should have access to those until they do.
And then things go terribly wrong, right? And unfortunately, in the infrastructure world, see, again, this is something that network infrastructure has always had this separation, and I wish it wasn't so. It's better now that we're running cloud and there's a lot of big control infrastructure there, but if you go back to traditional infrastructure world, some of that software is really, really old, and they don't want to upgrade it because the disruption potential is too much. Like it's the classic.
Well, and in this vulnerability, Telnet's vulnerable, leads to high CPU usage. The only way to remediate is to reboot the device. Now, anyone that's had to reboot a router, now we're talking about Cisco XE software. I'm assuming these are really big routers that rebooting them probably cause outages for a lot of. Then you got to reload all the BGP routes. We all know how long that can take. I mean, probably faster on some of these larger switches, routers, but still, that sucks.
You've got some splaining to do.
Yep. Gotta put my change control request in for that. Joff, I had my article number 4, Python Arbitrary File Write Prevention, the Tarbomb. So basically you're untarring a file and you can access and overwrite files outside of the directory structure. Operating systems like macOS have protections from that. What they're saying is that the Python standard library is vulnerable to this type of attack when used out of the box, and the article goes into ways to code it properly. Have you seen this before?
I have not seen it, to be honest with you. I'm looking at it right now. I mean, the tar file module, I wasn't aware of, but I'm not so sure I would directly call it a vulnerability because, let's be honest, if you're on a Unix system and you untar something, you can shoot yourself in the foot really easily.
Yes.
Right? I mean, your protection there is your operating system protections,
your file
which
system,
are your standard user stuff.
Yeah, file system permissions, right?
So, I'm not sure I buy it. I mean, is it something to be aware of? Sure. Is it really a security vulnerability per se? I don't know.
How often? I mean, are you the tar library in Python? I don't know how widely used is that. Like, what's the use cases for that?
I've never used it.
I've never
ever.
I'm curious if it's implemented in something like 7-zip or some of the open source things that are leveraging those libraries, because in that becomes an interesting issue. Like all of these leaked files or something that's coming down in a tar. If you can do interesting things with that.
And people use the tar library for output compression. So when they're dumping,
I was going to say, it sounds like a deserialization vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
And you have to be very careful anytime you're deserializing data. And that to me, that falls in that bucket, right? Of just being aware when you're a developer.
Yeah. Now, if you've got a object deserialization issue, I mean that is a serious issue, right? You trust, you don't just blindly trust your input, right? That's where object serialization.
I mean, don't blindly trust anything when you're writing code. That's developing our internal app. Man, I don't trust anything. I mean, I check if that shit's none, and then I check the length, and then I'm checking to make sure it's the right type. I'm just always checking, even if I can't immediately come up with the use case as to how that would happen. The more experience you get, the more you realize that those conditions will present itself, and you tend to code a lot more defensively. I've found the more experience you have developing an application that has users other than yourself. We're talking about Recon NG, right? You're the user of Recon NG, and therefore you can protect your API keys. But when you flip to writing an app that has external users, whether that's 5 or whether that's 5 million or 5 billion, right? You tend to code a lot more defensively, and that's not always your first instinct.
But there are two aspects there. So there is what I call the long dark night of programming, and that's where you're just stuck and you've been there for weeks and you've got a deadline and you're trying to get it. And here, oh my God, here's a solution, and you embed it.
Yes.
And so you don't
totally
think defensively. You're just oh my God, there it is. It's a holy grail, and you pull it in and you stick it in your code, and you go, oh my God, it worked. Oh God, it worked. And you're so happy.
Commit.
Yeah, done.
And
So I think that's one problem, and the second problem is changes to libraries after the fact. So you embed something, you were very defensive, and you took all these nice measures, and then 6 months down the road it changes, it's updated, there's a mod to it, and all of a sudden maybe something sort of worms its way in there that you didn't think about when you were coding defensively the first time because it wasn't.
That can be a benefit though, we were talking about Instapaper integration. The maintainer of that library is doing a great job of keeping up to date. But Some libraries may not.
Yes.
So no matter how defensible you are in your own code, if you're importing a library that hasn't been updated in 3 to 5 years, you're still going to have a vulnerability no matter what you do.
The further you get in the weeds with that stuff, the worse it gets. So you start, you get, again, you're back in the long dark night of programming. You're frantically looking for a solution.
I'm backing up my defensive things in my code to make that library work.
And now you're pulling some whacked out thing in there.
Go ahead, Joff.
This whole discussion is why I have a love affair with regular expressions. And I promote them, like ruthlessly when I teach the Python class. I mean, regular expression to me is like mathematical perfection. It is the way to take an input boundary and be very, very precise in what data you are accepting.
Yep.
And it can and will save you.
Yeah.
From serious exploitation conditions. And I think for any security professional and developer to fall in love with regular expressions, I could see nothing better. No matter what the language, no matter what the construct, regular expressions are your friend.
I agree, Jeff, but
you may be biased.
But here's the struggle that I think developers have is there's more than one way to accomplish that goal, and what's the right solution, right? And you've got to check for multiple, like checking for type. There's a lot of different ways that I've found to check for type. And that varies from Python 2 to Python 3, as you very well know, Joff, right? So what is, I got to check for type. And then if that's valid, then I have to check the input if it is of the correct type. And there's at least half a dozen ways, at least, to do that in Python. Is that true?
Well, there's a lot of ways to do it, but this is exactly why I made the statement I made, right? Once you know you've got the right type, if you even want to check that, smack a regular expression against it, stick it in an exception handler, and move on.
Yeah.
It does a hell of a lot for you because you throw the exception and get out of Dodge if nothing lines up. So, I'm a stickler for making sure whatever data that I'm processing is exactly the data that I expect. And every security professional should be that way.
Right. Don't be afraid to raise an exception, I think is the rule in Python, right?
But this is in the dangerous realm of
I don't understand this shit.
The dangerous realm of the assumption that people are good coders.
It's true. I've cleaned up a lot of bad code, right?
I mean, if Josh is coding it, I'm pretty good with it. But I mean, it's like that's not what you often get, and it's like assigned to somebody, and they wrote their sloppy ass code, and you're like, oh my god, we got to get this working.
I love try except else, right? Only do that if I didn't get an exception.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that, Paul, because exception handling can be a dark art in and of itself.
I've noticed that.
Yeah, because you get into this weird thing, especially if you fall into the habit of accepting and then using pass or continue in the exception handler. You can have hidden conditions which can go for years without you seeing them, but you might be missing data. You've protected your app properly, but your exception handler is sort of glossing over stuff.
It is like using pass and continue and an accept is probably not always the right answer.
Not really a good practice, but sometimes if you're in a hurry, it's going to get you where you need to be. You might miss a little bit of stuff.
Yeah, like returning in an accept, I try not to do that. I try and always raise, right? Because you want to pass that back to the calling function when you get into larger sets of Python code is one thing I learned the hard way and had to recode a bunch of stuff.
Well, and then there's the whole issue of scope specificness with the exception handling. Like, how deep do you want your exceptions? Do you want your exception handling to be way out somewhere on the global scope or on a class level scope, or do you want it to be really fine-grained and in on an individual function, individual statement usage within that function? And it's kind of a philosophy thing. You got to go, oh wow, how am I going to do this? You know?
Like, do I use one try except, or do I use 12? And the answer's likely somewhere in between, right? But
and you can tie yourself in knots. And do I actually want to try except that has a custom error message, then re-raise the exception, or what do I want to do? So it's a dark art.
But I think that's what leads to a lot of weird vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities in general is a lot of it, just like we've seen RFCs and TCP/IP, right? A lot of it's left up to the interpretation to the developer.
Yep.
And educating that developer on, like, what's the right way, right? That's left up to interpretation, especially when we're talking about exception handling.
The right way is what gets them the pay raise next time around. They do their performance review. That's the right way.
That's the right way. I like to think the right way is what's the most resilient and maintainable are two qualities that I look for when I write and implement software, but I don't always get there, of course.
Yeah.
Not many of us do, in all cases, for sure.
Look, hey, engineering software is a tough game. Nobody should go into that one lightly. I mean, really is. It takes some real experience.
Especially in the modern age where you're now going to assume that, when I wrote code, it was assumed that there was a small number of people that would have access to it. Now you have to assume everybody in the world's going to have access to it and be able to deconstruct it. And somebody's going to think around that box. And there's going to be people like Joff looking at it, or people like you looking at it.
Well, it's interesting you say that because we look at Firefox 78 is out, and if you read through the release notes, there's not a lot of information about what security bugs they fixed. And this has always been my gripe with software manufacturers, whether it be open source or commercial, that if there was a security vulnerability, I want to know as much detail, and I understand this is a double-edged sword, right? But I'm on the side of I want to know as much as possible so that I can put mitigations in place. If I don't understand the vulnerability, if I don't understand how it came to be, how it's implemented in code, if I don't have, the diff of what changed, essentially, at the end of the day, how am I going to defend my software? How am I going to defend my enterprise if I don't know the root cause of the vulnerability? And when you have software manufacturers that are putting out software saying, we fixed stuff, right? Or we fixed this and that was a security vulnerability, but we called it a bug. Or we fixed a bunch of stuff and we just didn't tell you all the details about what it was that fixed it. That puts the defenders at a disadvantage. It also puts the attackers at a disadvantage. And I get that balancing act, right? I guess I'm more in the camp of if we all know about it, it evens the playing field. However, from a defensive perspective, not everyone's going to look that deep into all of the security fixes to make use of that data.
A lot of that is, I think, due to the fact that most vendors assume and or believe that all of their end users are going to push whatever update they feed to them in a fairly quick manner, right? Like they assume that this is going to get done. So in that assumption, they don't always account for the fact that we may have to put in mitigating controls in the meantime in order to make this rollout happen within inside of our 90-day change window where we're taking down critical applications. Like,
have you ever played like Nintendo Wii with your kids and you load a game and it's like, I gotta like download this update, and your kids are like, I just want to play the game, and I'm like, I get that, dude. Like, I want to play the game too, right? So we're gonna skip that software update, right? Like, sometimes I think software manufacturers forget there are human beings and we just want to use the software and not take a time out.
Kids on the other end that are impatient.
Very impatient.
I was going to say, you jumped over to games, but we're hopefully talking about the enterprise.
Yeah.
When patches and updates and fixes are pushed out, I don't necessarily agree with Tyler in that the companies expect their users to just update. I think they... I think that's true to some degree, but I think it's much more, we put it out there, so our job is done. And from a liability perspective, it's on you now, not on us.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, I think that's probably way more accurate that way. But not providing that level of detail, I think there are good companies that do that, and I think a lot of that is long-standing culture, and some of that is age of the company and what kind of crap storm they've went through disclosing certain things, or that's also possible coming down from like their general counsel or their liabilities and compliance people with inside the company. Like, we can't really say this because that actively and negatively impacts and puts us at a liable risk. So there's always that business risk aspect.
But there's a legal issue there. Like, what's the? Do I absolve myself of responsibility as a software manufacturer once I make that patch available? And to what degree have I made it difficult for my users to apply that patch? And based on that difficulty level, where does the responsibility fall? In other words, I can put out a patch, but it's got a super high probability that's going to cause issues, and it's super hard to install. Therefore, my users aren't going to install it, and therefore be under more risk. What level of responsibility falls on the software manufacturer in that case? That's a legal. That's a good legal question.
Well, it's a legal question to some degree, but it's more of a case law. What are the precedents set for? In that sense, it's illegal. But there's a very old saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And I think that much more so the companies, their responsibility more or less ends with we put the bug out there, or the patch, the update, or whatever it is. We put it out there. We gave you the notice. It's on you. Interestingly, if I can segue a little bit, Lee has an article that his article number 10 kind of touches on sort of a real world scenario of a lot of what we're talking about. The article's talking about Adobe, who I guess now owns this company that produces a e-commerce platform called Magento, which their version 1 is getting ready to go end of life, meaning out of support, meaning there are going to be no more security bug fixes, patches, updates being released. And this impacts the PCI world because PCI, a common interpretation of one of the PCI requirements is you got to install all the security patches and keep things secure. And if a system's out of service, end of life, not being patched or updated, you can't really use it because you can't claim that there's any patches out there. And if you read the article, this older version has been out there for quite a while, and they've been postponing the end of life. For
so Jeff, so it says the 1.x branch was released in 2008 and was initially scheduled to reach end of life in November 2018. Right. I would say, obviously not being an attorney, right, but how well that was communicated to the user community and customers of that software, I would think plays into it, right? If they were very clear and somewhat frequent communications that here's the release, and then at some point here's when it's going to be end of life, and then there was 2 years between when they said it was going to be end of life to when it was actually end of life, that's a reasonable amount of time to allow for companies to upgrade to the 2.x version, right? To be able to receive support.
So a couple things, and I was, I'd never heard of this thing. I've not encountered it. So I was trying to figure out what exactly is it, and as near as I can tell, it's an e-commerce platform, including the shopping cart. 2008, when it came out, the company was Magento. Somewhere along the line, and I lost track of it. Adobe owns it now, but Adobe didn't own it a year or 2 or 3 ago. So part of the complications from a legal perspective is ownership and responsibility when the original company that first put out the system has been acquired 1 or 2 or 3 times.
And I'll throw another wrinkle in there, Jeff. What if you're an OEM that includes Magento and you haven't updated your software? Where does it fall? On Adobe, on Magento, or the OEM, or the customer?
Right.
Yeah.
That's why you have all those user agreements, though. You've agreed to all of them, and so it falls on you.
Everybody click through. But the article's talking about hundreds of thousands, some large number of merchants that are out there that are all online stores of some sort, which means they're probably small, which means they probably don't do much in the way of security. They don't have all this infrastructure that we always imply that they have. They've gotten roped into PCI because they know that, but they've got this thing that does it for them that supposedly that's all they have to worry about. Ironically, and I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but Magento is, falls into the category sort of a payment application. And one of the PCI overarching requirements is merchants are supposed to use approved, evaluated, certified payment systems and payment applications. There's separate compliance programs and certification programs that look at the technology, both the hardware technology and the software technology that comprise payment systems. So ordinarily, if I was looking at a retailer or a merchant and they were using payment solution X, one of my activities is to go to the PCI site and look it up and make sure that it's an approved, certified, current system. They're not on there at all. And I think the reason why I don't know why they're not on there, but the article is talking about, companies are going to fall out of compliance if they're still using it because they're not going to be able to keep things current. I'm like, they should be out of compliance because they're using something that's just not even on the approved list in the first place.
Job, is this the danger of writing software that's like too good? Like if you put out a piece of software that just works, right? It almost de-incentivizes people from upgrading to the latest version because it works so well. I mean, mainframe technology, to some of your background, Doug, right? Yeah. And things like that. It just works.
The industry has clearly suffered from that, right? And is it really suffering? I mean, when you think about
it works that well.
Older software tends to work better than newer software because it's battle tested.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it may contain vulnerabilities and you may not be updating it, but people are still using it because it's super reliable and super resilient to maybe not the specific vulnerabilities that it has, but it works.
Well, the only reason somebody's going to update something like that is if there are features that are needed that are in a new version. Otherwise, they're never going to touch it. I mean, if you go in there and say, we want to do an update, they're going to go, why?
Right.
Why do we need to update?
Well, that's when we get in the concept of virtual patching in like a Windows environment, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, I'm running the older versions of Windows or whatever, but it works. Like my medical device works, or this specific device works.
And if you upgrade, you break everything.
If I upgrade, I break everything. So I need a virtual patch that mitigates the vulnerability that allows me to run that older, arguably more reliable software than the newer version.
I mean, we did that all the time simply because it did work. And so instead of developing something new that was better, we just fixed what was there because it was a matter of them going, here's your budget. You want to spend a whole long time developing something better, or just wrap some more duct tape around that whole algorithm and keep it running.
I think that's the reason why, like, a lot of us older folks and more experienced folks that have been doing implementations and software and ops for a long time are hesitant to upgrade because we know that the newer shit's probably going to present more problems than the older stuff because we've been burned so many times by doing upgrades. We're hesitant to upgrade.
I mean, I always hold off on like Windows and things like that because they're going, upgrade to Windows 45, and you're going, I don't know, I've been using Windows 40, it works, I haven't had any problems.
Yeah.
And the last time you did Windows 43, it was like a total disaster, and 2 years later, everybody's laughing at people that adopted it, and then they're having to upgrade again. And I go to my boss and say,
I go to Windows ME.
But I go to my boss. If I go in my boss and I stand in front of those managers and I say, yes, we need to do this, that's on me when it comes back and it's a disaster. And a year later, they're going, why in the hell did we do this? Oh, Doug said it was a good idea. I'm like, oh, yeah, I thought it was a good idea, but maybe it wasn't. And so you learn through pain that maybe we stick with what works and not worry about that until we really, really need to.
There is something to be said for being burned and being hesitant to upgrade.
It teaches you.
Well, I remember
Jeff and then Joff.
I remember in the early days of this thing that we call InfoSec and consulting, it was considered security best practice to tell people not to run the current version of operating systems or applications. It was better to stay a version or two back just because you wanted to let all the bugs get worked out ahead of time. When did we stop giving that as security best practice advice?
We didn't. I didn't.
Joff?
Well, actually, we still do, right? There's long-term releases of operating systems. Ubuntu does it, right?
They do.
Ubuntu does their LTS. But I want to put Paul into the Wayback Machine for a minute. If you go back to your university days, I literally had clients that flat refused to get off of an MS-DOS-based system.
Yeah.
And go to Windows because they could run their single-threaded statistical program in that DOS environment.
Oh. Yep.
And by God, it worked.
Yep.
All day long. I
It
remember
wasn't just a university environment.
No,
John.
It was everybody.
It was everyone. And to Josh's point,
Who
like,
the hell needs Windows?
I remember having to put on like booties over my shoes and like the jacket and the hairnet to walk into research
center.
facility. And like Josh said, like that stuff was running DOS, it was running Windows 95, it was running Windows 2000, and they were really expensive, lots of research dollars, right? Many of us have been in the situation that were running that stuff, and they're like, upgrade, what are you talking about? There's millions of dollars literally that are funding this research, and quite literally could have been a cure, working on a cure for certain types of cancer, and you know, here you are, security, and what are you gonna do? Be like, you need to upgrade and break all of your stuff, right? Like that's, it's an interesting dilemma that we run into in security.
I have to tell you, you know, back in my early days of NSA, where everything was client server, mainframe based, and NSA had its own operating system running on the mainframes and supercomputers, and their own highly optimized, shall we say, programming language. I remember the day when they said, okay, we're switching over to Unix workstations and we're going to network everything, and everything had to be rewritten. But what was more impressive and sticks in my memory is office after office after office that had huge boxes. I mean, you know, the old Sun, you know, pizza boxes, workstations, and the old monitors.
ES450s, they were like mini fridges.
I mean, but you know, NSA
I
bought
love those things, Paul.
tens of thousands of them. I mean, I think NSA single-handedly, you know, made Sun the company that it was.
Oh, universities too, and no, don't knock on Sun.
Amazing.
Those machines were awesome back in the day, for sure.
Oh, they were once they booted.
Which took some time. Took some time.
And
I love that. I'll never forget.
They took a half an hour to boot back in those days, literally.
I never forget when I saw my first Sun E450. It was like a Borg cube.
It is
was the best part.
Yeah.
Yep.
It was purple and blue. It was beautiful. It's beautiful.
That was cool.
I was waiting for the delivery. I was in the computing of the university campus, and the truck rolled up into the center, and he opened up the tailgate, and I'm like, I'm excited. I'm looking out the window, and he realized there was no loading bay to the building, and so he and a couple of guys got in the truck, laid down, kicked the ES450 off the back of the tailgate, and it fell onto the concrete, and everybody heard it inside the building.
Right.
And
it was totally fine. Totally fine.
Yeah, well, it was actually, but I still walked out of the building. I said, yeah, I'm refusing delivery. But it was a good day. That thing was loaded for bear, man. The amount of discs you could throw in that thing.
It was.
Oh, I loved it.
It was like I literally have a mini fridge in my man cave that's smaller than an E450.
Yeah, that's a big one.
That cools my beer. That's how massive
actually,
these
if
things.
there was, aside from a PDP-11 or whatever, if there's one piece of computing gear that I would like to have in my museum, it would be that Sun E450 cube. But that thing was awesome.
Yeah, I used to have a bunch of those too, and I got rid of because they take up a lot of space.
They take a lot of space.
They do. Are we going to wrap this shit up?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a perfect segue. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching to this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Someone take us out.
Over and, well, you know, out.